Hola, muy buenas tardes. Bueno, vamos a comenzar entonces con la lectura del artículo. Access and use of financial markets for basic education expenses. Abstract. As a result of the financial crisis of 2008, the macroeconomic adjustment has affected Mexican homes through greater unemployment and a drop in purchasing power. Moreover, families had to keep financing education costs, sometimes going into debt in the formal or informal financial market. The hypothesis of this article proposes that the access and use of formal and informal financial products makes it possible to reduce financial problems associated to education expenses at the basic education levels. The profit model is estimated with a sample comprised of 400 homes in the municipality of San Pedro Cholula, state of Puebla. The results indicate that worsening in the work conditions and the loss of employment and associated to a greater probability of facing financial difficulties. Likewise, the access to the formal financial market allows reducing the probability of facing these difficulties. Whereas for the informal market, the results are a function of the characteristics of each financial intermediary. Background information. Education can be considered in different ways as a consumer good that provides a benefit for the individuals without having any type of incidence in productivity, as a means to help identify and grade skills and abilities, as a means to increase human capital, which in turn is considered a productive factor given the relation between the knowledge level of the workers and their capacity to use them and by extension, their productivity. According to this last perspective, the education cost is an investment that generates better living conditions for the individual that receives. In this sense, at an individual level, education is a process that contributes to the development of each human being, through which it is possible to access a higher income and better services. While at a collective level, there is a general consensus to consider is a level for social development. Regarding the aforementioned, there is a close relation between the level of education and the income level to the individuals, with evident intergenerational benefits associated to the level of education and prosperity of future generations. On the other hand, it is noted that in Mexico, the percentage income allocated to education decreases as the household income increases, with the exception of the last 10%, that is, education cost by the poorest strata is significantly lower than that corresponding to the high strata of society. However, the low strata of society focus their expenses of the basic level, whereas the high strata do it on higher education. Similarly, it is observed that the people in households with a lower income study fewer years and under worse conditions than those with higher income. Education, human capital, and economic results. The importance of education at the individual level lies in being a permanent process that contributes to the development of a person, as well as being the main means to obtain, convey, and enhance culture, and being a determining factor in the acquisition of knowledge and personal development. Human capital, which according to Becker is defined as the set of the productive capacities that an individual acquires through the accumulation of general or specific knowledge, is the bridge between education and work, with the latter being the culmination of that at what was learned during the school years, strengthened by experience and daily practice in the labor market. The early years of life and the proper development of people are essential for their development as productive individuals. In this stage, the care of the parents, the access to a balanced diet and medical service, as well as the possibility of obtaining timely and quality education, make it possible for individuals at an intergenerational level to achieve better standards of living through a virtuous circle. One of the manifestations through which this aspect can be appreciated is the economic results of micro enterprises, which in Mexico represent 95.6% of the productive units and employ up to 45.6% of the workforce. However, they only contribute with 15% of the gross domestic product. In this regard, it is understood that as the level of education of the micro entrepreneur increases, operating profits gradually increase when compared to those with only primary education, concluding that with a higher level of education, it is expected for the micro entrepreneur to have skills that, along with a better understanding of the issues, will allow them to analyze and make better decisions that result in positive results for the micro enterprise. These results are also supported by the data published by ProMexico in 2014 and the Economic Data Bank, where the correlation between the average school years per state with the productivity index is of 68.9%, and with regard to the average of the gross income per economic activity is of 41.6% for manufacture and 39% for commerce and services. Education in Mexico. In the face of the results that have evidenced in the shortcomings of the Mexican educational system and at an international level, this has been the target of an important reform approved in December 2012 and enacted in February 2013, even when it is still too soon to be able to determine the impact of the educational reform. The measures taken by the state before the reform already reflected in an increase in the gross enrollment rate, or coverage, in primary and secondary education, where for basic education the figures reported by the SEP indicate that at national level, during the 1990 and 1991 school cycle, there was a 95.9% coverage for the primary level, which increased to 98.6% for the 2009 and 2010 school age cycle. Furthermore, at the secondary level, considering at the 1990 and 1991 school cycle, this was not obligatory. The national coverage increased from 68% to 95.3% 2009-2010 school cycle. According to the figures published by the UNESCO, in 2009, the net rate of school enrollment at the primary level was for 93.9% children between 6 and 12 years of age, 67.2% for secondary teenagers between 12 and 15 years of age, but only 25.7% of young people enrolled in preparatory. This percentage reflected that the higher the level of education, the greater the difference between the gross rate and the net rate of enrollment, that is, the percentage of the population enrolled that does not comply with the corresponding age of that academic level is greater. Additionally, it must be noted that secondary education and middle school are still not attainable for a significant sector of the population, and many young people that join these school levels drop out and do not finish their studies. Causes of school dropouts. The literature that has analyzed the causes associated to school dropouts indicated that they are mainly due to the lack of financial resources to cover the direct enrollment and tuition fees, and indirect work materials, uniforms, and transport costs of attending school, as well as the perception of a low education quality. Those students who have lesser abilities are the most likely to drop out of school, and having work activities could also affect attendance, school results, and ultimately the permanence at the educational institution. The financial crisis that hit the global economy in 2008 has modified the distribution of national budgets. According to the UNESCO 2011, several of the poorest countries in the world have had their plans for education funding affected, having to adjust their objectives for 2015. In Mexico, the percentage of GDP allocated to education increased for 4.7% for 2008-2007 to 4.9% in 2008 to reach 5.2% in the 3-year period of 2008-2011. Despite this increase, the lack of employment and the loss of purchasing power due to the financial crisis could generate pressure and financial trouble in households. Although education costs are the result of a process of resource allocation that reflects a structure of priority and social, family, and individual objectives. It should also take into consideration the economic resources available in the household. For this, the financial crisis of 2008 resulted in a reduced growth of the GDP 1.2% when compared to the previous year, 3.3% in 2007, but with a drop in 2009, minus 6.1%, followed by a partial recovery, 5.5% in 2010. The drop in production was followed by an increase in the inflation that decreased the purchasing power of the wage and by an increase in the open unemployment rate, mainly in 2009, same which in 2010 still did not manage to go back to the levels prior to the crisis. This increase in the hour affected both genders. For men, it increased from 3.9% 2008 to 5.5% 2009, settling at 5.4% for 2010. Similarly, for women, it went from 4.1% in 2008 to 5.5% 2009, cycling at 5.4% for 2010. In addition to an increase in unemployment, the employed population observed lower wage. Due to the above, it could be anticipated that these adjustments affect families at a macroeconomic level, especially if the one providing resources to the household lost their employment or if they managed to relocate, depending on the new labor conditions. This article associates the effects of the financial crisis with having faced some difficulty to cover the expenses of education, a situation that has already been addressed by the UNESCO. In its Education for All Global Monitoring report, when observing a reduction in the resources allocated to this sector, despite the fact that the cost per student in primary and secondary school shows an upward trend in the years following the financial crisis. An explanation an explanation for this tendency is that the households could have resorted to formal or informal credit markets to pay for these expenses. In this sense, the National Survey on Financial Inclusion presents some evidence, despite expenses in education being grouped in the education or health expenses category, which makes it impossible to isolate the interest variable from the 38.6% of the population that had saved in the past year, 2011. Only 29.55% allocated these resources to education or health expenses. In the same manner, 35.96% applied for informal credits, of which 38.93% also allocated that money for to education or health expenses. Regarding formal financing, 30.76% used to loan money for this same purpose. In addition to the above, Braid indicates that the expense in education can be divided into opportunity costs, those activities that the individuals or families stop doing to invest in education, and monetary expenses that can be done inside collaboration and school fees and outside of the schools purchase of uniforms, stationery, transport, and paperwork. In the educational systems of industrialized countries, the expenses inside the school are fully covered by the government, and the expenses outside the school comprise a small portion of the total expense of the households. However, in countries where the capacity to the state to finance public education is limited, families have to try to co-finance the education of their members. In relation to Puebla, which is the state that is the object of this article, it is listed as the sixth state with the lowest school attendance. On average, its inhabitants have 7.9 years of education, below the national average 8.7 years, and has high levels of dropouts for the primary 1.2% and secondary school 4.7% levels, particularly for the municipality of San Pedro Cholula, where the empirical study was carried out. A greater number of dropouts than those at a state level can be observed, both of primary and secondary school, with 1.3% and 5.2% respectively. Bueno, vamos a dejar el resumen hasta aquí del artículo. Básicamente, básicamente el artículo pues analiza cómo cambió el ahorro en el país en varios años. Básicamente, bueno, en el país que es México, entre 1993 y 2015, distinguiendo entre ahorro de los hogares, las empresas y el gobierno y evaluando el papel en el desarrollo económico. El estudio muestra que el ahorro pues, ha crecido en términos absolutos, pero sigue siendo insuficiente para las necesidades de inversión que México requiere, sobre todo en la educación, que es en lo que se basa el artículo. Un hallazgo importante es que el ahorro privado, o sea, el de las familias y las empresas, ha sido la principal fuente de los recursos. En contraste con eso, el ahorro público ha sido muy limitado, incluso negativo en algunos periodos, debido a los déficits fiscales y al endeudamiento del gobierno. Eso significa que en lugar de contribuir, el sector público en ciertos momentos le ha restado al ahorro nacional. Y cuando se compara pues ya de forma internacional, decidí encontrar este artículo porque se parece mucho al tema también de nuestro país, de Colombia. Entonces la tasa de ahorro en México es más baja que la de otros países emergentes como China o Corea del Sur. Esto hace que la economía dependa en mayor medida del financiamiento externo y eso genera vulnerabilidad frente a crisis internacionales, por ejemplo. Entonces, pues sí concluye que es necesario fortalecer la cultura del ahorro en los hogares, incentivar el ahorro de las empresas y sobre todo mejorar la disciplina fiscal del gobierno. En resumen, aunque en México, como le digo, pues como digo, también se puede traducir a Colombia porque es un caso muy parecido, aunque ha avanzado, el nivel de ahorro sigue siendo un desafío para financiar de manera sostenible el crecimiento económico y el acceso a la educación. Entonces, básicamente, un país que no ahorra lo suficiente depende del capital extranjero y eso aumenta la exposición a riesgos externos. Y ya directamente, pues como aprendizaje para nuestro campo de estudio, que es la ingeniería financiera, pues hay varias cosas a tener en cuenta. Primero, que el ahorro interno es la base para el desarrollo de la inversión productiva, que los déficits públicos afectan la capacidad de un país para generar ahorro, estabilidad financiera y acceso a derechos como la educación. Y pues por último, que nosotros como ingenieros financieros tenemos que promover instrumentos y estrategias que fomenten el ahorro en la población y en las empresas, además de proponer políticas de financiamiento responsables. El ahorro no es solo un tema microeconómico de las familias, sino que es un pilar estratégico de la estabilidad económica y del crecimiento sostenible de un país. Listo, eso sería todo. Muchas gracias.